Most storms give a man time to think. Enough minutes to tighten a cinch, say a prayer, maybe curse whatever fool choice led him into the cold. But this storm gave no warnings at all. It came roaring out of the Bitterroot Range like some wild, furious thing ripped loose from God's basement, hammering the earth with a white rage so blinding it erased the world in minutes. And in that crushing silence between thunderclaps, Wyatt Cole, scarred, frostbitten, half-broken, saw a human shadow collapse into the snow. He knew one truth instantly. If he didn't reach them fast, they'd be dead before the wind even changed direction. February 1885, Montana Territory. Wyatt Cole leaned into the saddle as the wind slapped him like a fistful of knives. Thunder, his old battle-scarred stallion, snorted steam, fighting every step toward the fence line. Snow hammered them sideways, sharp and relentless, building drifts faster than a man could curse them. Wyatt's coat, an old Union cavalry shell patched so many times it barely remembered its original color, flapped hard against his ribs. The cold crawled down his spine with cruel fingers. His right leg throbbed with that familiar, punishing ache, the old Antietam wound that never let him forget the war, not even in sleep. "Easy, boy," he muttered, though his own voice felt brittle. The storm howled louder in answer. He'd almost missed it. A dark smear, a stumbling shape, a woman, or maybe just a bundle of fabric, pitching sideways into the snow like a deer shot clean through. Wyatt's stomach dropped. No, come on, move! Thunder hesitated, then lunged forward through the white curtain. 40 yards might as well have been 40 miles. But he reached her. Face down, frozen stiff except for the faint, fragile twitch of breath. Fine leather coat, silk peeking underneath. City clothes, not built for this country. "Hold on," he growled, dropping to his knees. Agony screamed through his wounded leg. He ignored it. He rolled her gently, feeling for breath. There, weak and shallow as a dying ember. "You ain't quitting on me today, miss." He slung her across Thunder's saddle, climbed up behind her, and pressed his chest to her back to keep what warmth he had against her thin body. Then he pointed the horse into the screaming void. The storm ate sound, sight, even hope. Wyatt guided Thunder by memory, by the rhythm of fence posts he could no longer see, by the lean of the wind against his face, by the faith a man puts in the only creature who's never lied to him. When the cabin finally materialized from the white blur, Wyatt nearly folded with relief. He kicked the door open, dragged her inside, and laid her near the hearth. Her lips were blue, her breathing a thread about to snap. He ripped off her soaked coat, her boots, hands trembling from cold and urgency, fine fox fur lining, brass crest, wealth, a life far from this brutal land. He wrapped her in his only wool blanket, the one his mother had woven before the coughing took her. Then he lit the fire with shaking hands. Pine caught quick, flames rising high and golden, painting the walls with restless orange. Slowly, dangerously slowly, color returned to her cheeks. Wyatt let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Hours later, she stirred. Eyes fluttered open, dark, sharp, disoriented. She looked from the fire to the rough-cut roof beams to Wyatt sitting across from her, boots still covered in half-melted snow. "You're safe now," he said softly, voice gravel-deep. "You ran awful close to the end." She swallowed, her lips cracked. "Where am I?" "My place, 3 miles out of Timberline." He handed her a tin cup. "Coffee. Bitter as sin, but it'll warm you some." She drank, winced. "It's terrible." He smiled, a small, tired thing. "Ma'am, that's the nicest thing anyone said about it." She hesitated before giving her name. "Niall," Wyatt nodded once, accepting it without judgment. They shared his last portion of beans and salt pork, sat in a soft, unexpected quiet, listened to the storm claw at the windows while the fire whispered between them. And for a single night, two strangers, one wounded by war, one trapped by secrets, found a fragile piece carved out of a frozen world. If you want to hear what becomes of Wyatt and Neil, hit subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of this frontier tale. The West is just warming up, and their story is only beginning. Morning crept into the cabin slow and pale, like a tired ranch hand easing into another thankless day. The storm had spent itself sometime before dawn, leaving the land wrapped in a brittle, unforgiving silence. Inside Wyatt Cole's one-room cabin, the air was warmer but still heavy with the scent of wet wool, pine smoke, and a hint of fear. Fear that the woman he'd dragged out of that blizzard might not make it through her first sunrise. Wyatt stirred the fire with a poker, watching flames dance around the last good log he had. He'd burned everything else through the night: kindling, chair legs, even the cracked shelf he'd been meaning to fix. Didn't matter. A shelf could be rebuilt. A life couldn't. Behind him, Neil slept on his bunk under the wool blanket, her breathing slow but steady. Her clothes hung near the hearth. Silk, fox fur, embroidery finer than anything that belonged in a place like this. Every stitch looked like it had cost more than his whole winter supply of beans. Wyatt rubbed his hands together, feeling the sting of half-thawed skin. His knuckles were swollen, scraped raw from hauling her through the storm. He didn't regret it for a second. When she finally woke, it was with a soft gasp. Confused, fragile, frightened in a way she tried hard to hide. "You're still with the living," Wyatt said gently. "Didn't reckon the good Lord had let you quit that easy." Her eyes, dark, alert, intelligent, took in the room slowly. The rough-hewn table, the rusted stove, his old cavalry coat hanging from a peg, and then him, sitting cross-legged by the fire, sleeves rolled up, tension living in every cord of muscle along his weather-beaten arms. "Where am I?" she whispered. "My cabin. You collapsed near the fence line yesterday." He handed her a tin cup again, coffee burned nearly black. "Drink slow. It's mean stuff." She sipped and coughed, wiping her mouth. "That is terrible." Wyatt let out a quiet laugh. "That's what I keep hearing." Her gaze drifted to her mended coat. "You stitched that?" He shifted a little, embarrassed. "Did what I could. Needle's older than I am." She sat up, clutching the blanket close around her shoulders. And then, surprising them both, she reached for his torn shirt lying across the table. "This needs fixing too," she said softly. "That ain't necessary." "I want to," she replied, her voice steady but tender. Wyatt didn't know what to do with that. Kindness was a rare thing out here, rarer still when it had no reason behind it. He fumbled with a coil of twine just to keep his hands busy. "Suit yourself," he muttered. As she threaded the needle, her fingers moved with practiced grace. He watched, quietly, almost reverently. Something about the moment felt too gentle for a man as battered as him. Her gaze flicked to the stack of books on the shelf she'd noticed last night. Spines worn down but cared for. "You read Emerson?" she asked, brow lifting slightly. Wyatt shrugged, flushing like a boy caught doing something he'd been teased for. "Helps keep the mind from rustin'. Storms and winters'll kill a man if he ain't got thoughts worth holding on to." She looked at him with a softness he wasn't prepared for. "You're not what I expected. Most folks say I'm less. I didn't say that." The silence that settled then was a different kind, warm, crackling, alive, like the moment before a spark becomes flame. Outside, the world glittered under a hard blue sky, snow shining like hammered silver. Inside, something smaller, but maybe more dangerous, was thawing too. By the third day, the storm had moved on, leaving the valley glittering under a hard winter sun. Drifts piled as high as a man's waist sparkled like they were dusted with diamonds. But inside Wyatt Cole's cabin, warmth clung to the air. Quiet, tender, almost shy. Niole sat at the table repairing the last tear in Wyatt's shirt, her hands steady and graceful even in the rough morning light. Wyatt pretended to be busy splitting kindling, but the truth was, he was studying her from the corner of his eye. Her calm focus, her careful breath, the way her dark hair fell in loose waves despite the cold. She didn't belong to this world of wood smoke and frost-bitten mornings, yet she carried herself with a strength that didn't come from silk dresses or fancy city rooms. It was something deeper, resilient, unbroken. "You sure you're warm enough?" Wyatt asked, voice rough from disuse. She nodded. "Warmer than I was 2 nights ago." He felt heat crawl up his neck. There weren't many compliments he trusted, but that one landed solidly in his ribs. When she finished stitching, her gaze drifted again to the small stack of books on his shelf. Emerson, Thoreau, a battered volume of Whitman whose pages had yellowed like old grass. "I didn't expect a man who rides through blizzards to read philosophy," she said. Wyatt grunted. "World's loud. Books quiet it down. A man needs that sometimes." She gave a soft smile, but didn't push further. Instead, her fingers moved to the gold locket at her throat, a heavy, ornate piece that seemed almost too bold for the quiet way she carried herself. Wyatt had seen her touch it 100 times over the last 2 days, but always with a flash of pain behind her eyes. "That locket important?" he finally asked. She hesitated. "Yes, more than I can explain." Wyatt nodded. Folks had their ghosts. He had a whole cavalry of them. He stepped to the shelf and took down a tin box, setting it between them on the table. "My ghosts are in here," he said. She looked at him with caution and curiosity mixed. "May I?" He pushed the box toward her. "Ain't much to hide." Inside were a handful of old relics, a Union cavalry button, weathered and bent, a small photo of a younger Wyatt in uniform, a folded discharge paper, a land deed, its ink faded, the edges soft with handling. She lifted the deed gently, almost reverently. "This was your family's farm?" she asked. "Was," Wyatt said, jaw tight. "Banks don't wait on busted soldiers hobbling home from war." "But you paid, didn't you?" "Every cent. Still wasn't enough. Came home to an empty field and a man with a ledger saying I defaulted." His voice went flinty. "Never even let Ma and Pa harvest the last crop." Niole froze, fingers trembling against the parchment. Her breath hitched, small, sharp, guilty. Wyatt mistook the look on her face for pity and bristled. "Don't you feel sorry for me? Just the way things go." But she wasn't pitying him. She was breaking. Her father's voice slammed into her memory. Taza, powerful, ruthless, boasting of land acquisitions, the spoils of post-war opportunity, the necessary sacrifices to grow the timberline empire. She swallowed hard. That gold crest on her locket, his crest, seemed to burn against her skin. "Wyatt," she whispered. "There are things you don't know." He raised a brow. "You're welcome to say 'em or not. Ain't my way to press a person." She opened her mouth, closed it again. The truth clawed at her throat, but fear beat it back. If he knew, if he discovered who she belonged to, He might never look at her with this quiet trust again. So she said nothing, only held the deed with shaking hands and the weight of a secret that could shatter them both. Snow still clung to the eaves of Wyatt's cabin when Neil finally left, bundled in the coat he'd dried by the fire and stitched with careful, clumsy hands. She rode away before he woke, leaving behind only a folded note and the faint memory of her quiet breath in the warm glow of dawn. Wyatt found the note hours later. Polite, grateful, painfully formal. He read it twice, then tucked it under his bunk as if hiding it would steady the strange ache in his chest. But while the cold morning settled soft around Wyatt's place, the world she returned to was anything but gentle. Taysa's estate rose over timberline like a fortress carved from pride itself. Stone walls, iron lanterns, and enough polished woodwork to shame half the town's lumber mills. The place was built not just to endure winters, but to remind every man within 50 miles that Taysa was wealth, influence, and power wrapped in a single unyielding figure. When Neil stepped through the carved front doors, the air grew tighter, heavier, as if the house itself disapproved of the snow-stained boots she still wore. Taysa stood in the center of the foyer, hands clasped behind his back. His posture was rigid, carved from discipline and disappointment. His broad shoulders carried the weight of empire. His sharp, storm-dark eyes carried the weight of loss. His wife's ghost never far from his shadow. "Where were you?" His voice was low, controlled, but trembling beneath the surface like a distant earthquake. Neil lifted her chin. "I was caught in the storm." "Don't insult me," he snapped. "My men searched every ridge, every line of trees. You were gone, disappeared." "I survived," she said. "That should matter more than—" "It matters where you were." The words cracked like a whip. Behind him, Morgan Blackwood watched with a predator's confidence. Tall, handsome in a polished sort of way, he embodied the kind of man who thrived on leverage, not strength. He leaned against the banister with a lazy smirk that made Neil's stomach twist. "Well now," Blackwood drawled, "looks like the prodigal daughter returns. And in one piece. Imagine that." Taysa didn't give her room to answer. He jabbed a finger toward her coat, Wyatt's coarse stitching impossible to miss. "You were with someone," he said. "Who?" Her breath hitched. She had to be careful. Wyatt didn't deserve to be dragged into her world. "Just a rancher," she said quietly. Blackwood's grin sharpened. "A rancher patched your sleeves with thread fit for a horse blanket? Generous fellow. Or desperate?" He stepped closer, voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You should remember your place, Neil. Some men mistake kindness for invitation." Taysa cut him a warning glance, but didn't deny the sentiment. Neil held her ground. "He saved my life." "Then he'll be compensated," Taysa declared. "Handsomely." "No." The word escaped before she could stop it. Blackwood barked a laugh. Taysa's face darkened, the old grief and new anger mixing into something brittle. "You forget yourself," he said coldly. "This family stands on duty, on alliances. The engagement is a business deal," she shot back. Blackwood raised a single brow, amused. Taysa's jaw locked until the muscle twitched. "Whether you agree or not," he said. "It happens." Neil felt the cage close again, the fine silk walls, the gold-lined prison that had followed her since childhood. Wyatt's cabin, with its uneven table and battered books, had been more free than every polished room in this house. And as she climbed the stairs to her room, she pressed the locket flat against her chest. The metal felt heavier than ever. She had left one secret behind at Wyatt's cabin. Now she carried the heavier one home. News traveled faster than freight in a small western town. Faster than wind, faster than reason. By the time Wyatt Cole rode into Timberline with a sack of horseshoe nails slung across his saddle, half the town already knew that Taz's men had delivered a wagon load of expensive tools to his cabin. Tools worth more than his entire homestead. Tools a man like him had no business touching. Wyatt had stared at them for a long while that morning. Polished handles, gleaming steel, everything wrapped in tight canvas like gifts for a wedding he'd never be invited to. He'd loaded every last piece back into the wagon and driven it straight toward town, jaw set, heart pounding with something sharp and miserable. He didn't want her father's gratitude. He sure as hell didn't want Blackwood's smug approval. Timberline's streets were muddy thaw beneath melting snow, and folks stopped sweeping, sawing, or gossiping just long enough to watch Wyatt lead that wagon right up to the mercantile porch. His coat was patched, his gloves worn thin at the fingertips, but he moved with a stubborn steadiness that made folks whisper. Inside, the mercantile smelled of flour, leather, and the sharp tang of kerosene. Wyatt pushed the door open, the bell above jangling like it was warning everyone inside to brace themselves. Taza's foreman, a stiff-backed man in a tailored overcoat, turned from the counter. "Mr. Cole, I trust you received the tools." Wyatt dropped the receipt on the counter. "They're back in your wagon." The foreman blinked. "Sir, this was a gesture of—" "I know what it was," Wyatt cut in, voice low and hard. "And I'm saying no." A hush fell over the mercantile. Heads turned, fingers froze over fabric bolts and crates of beans. Then Morgan Blackwood stepped out from the gun rack aisle, slow and smug, like a cat who'd been waiting on a mouse to twitch wrong. He looked Wyatt up and down, lips curling in a predator's grin. "Landless charity case has pride," Blackwood drawled. "How touching." Wyatt didn't rise to it. Not yet. Blackwood walked closer, boots clicking sharp on the wood floor. "You sure you want to do this, Cole? A man turns down generosity from a family like Taza's. Folks start asking questions." "Let 'em," Wyatt said. "I ain't beholden to anyone." Blackwood smirked. "You think Niall sent those tools because she cares about you? Lord above, that's rich." He leaned in, voice dripping poison. "She belongs to a world you ain't even fit to sweep the steps of." Wyatt's eyes flicked up, slow and steady, like a storm gathering weight. "I reckon she belongs with the man who treats her like a person," he said, "not property." Gasps rippled through the room. Even the old potbelly stove seemed to pause its wheezing. Blackwood's smile cracked. The foreman sputtered. "Mr. Cole, you're making a mistake." "No," Wyatt said, stepping back. "Mistake's thinking you can buy off a man's conscience." He tipped his hat to the stunned clerk, turned on his heel, and walked out the door into the blinding sun. The wagon remained where it was, unclaimed, untouched, unwanted. Timberline buzzed like a stirred hornet nest behind him, but Wyatt didn't look back. His boots struck the muddy ruts with the rhythm of a man who'd just decided he'd rather be broke than bought. Out on the road, thunder snorted, restless beneath the reins. "Easy, boy," Wyatt murmured. "I know. But some fights ain't about winning. They're about not bowing." What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Niall, hearing every word secondhand, would feel the echo of that defiance like a spark in the ribs, and that Blackwood, humiliated, would carry that slight like a loaded weapon. The West had teeth, and someone had just bared them. By the time the sun dipped low behind the Bitterroot Range, Timberline was buzzing like a stirred hornet nest. Folks leaned over hitching posts, whispered outside the saloon, and traded stories thick with exaggeration. Wyatt Cole turning down a fortune, calling out Morgan Blackwood in the mercantile, and walking away with the kind of quiet defiance only a man with nothing left to lose could carry. In Taza's mansion, however, there was no whispering, only thunder. Taza slammed the study door behind him, the sound rattling the window panes. His face, usually composed, carved from stone and pride, was flushed with fury. "You humiliated this family," he roared, pacing like a caged bull. "A public refusal, a spectacle. Every ranch hand and store clerk in Timberline now thinks they can speak of us like we're common." Neol stood rigid, hands clasped in front of her. Her heartbeat thudded so loud she barely heard him. "I didn't ask him to return the tools," she said quietly. "You didn't need to," Taza snapped. "The moment you stepped foot in that cabin, you crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed." Blackwood leaned in the corner, arms folded, his smirk sharp and hateful. "She's sentimental, sir. It's understandable." His tone oozed false sympathy. "She doesn't know how men like Cole twist a woman's gratitude into something else." Neol's jaw tightened. "You don't know him." Blackwood pushed off the wall, swaggering a few steps closer. "Oh, but I do. I know exactly what kind of man patches a lady's coat and plays hero with no coin in his pocket." "Enough," Taza snapped again. But something in Blackwood's eyes said he had already won this round. Taza sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. "The engagement is final. Timberline depends on this alliance, on stability. Your wandering off into blizzards and cabins jeopardizes everything." Neol felt something inside her snap. Quietly, irrevocably. "I will not let you trade my life away," she murmured. Taza's fist struck the desk. Papers jumped. "This is not about what you will or will not allow." Blackwood stepped back with a satisfied little smile. Neol felt suddenly cold. Cold in a way even Wyoming winters couldn't explain. Without another word, she turned and left the room, the door slamming behind her. Before the sun even brushed the horizon the next morning, Neol stood in the frost-bitten courtyard, tightening the saddle cinch on her mare. Breath fogged the air. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the clarity of a choice made without permission. If her father wanted her to be silent, she'd answer with the one thing he feared most: her own will. She rode out before the estate had fully woken, wind stinging her cheeks as she cut across frozen pasture land. The closer she came to Wyatt's cabin, the more her chest tightened. Not in fear, but in something she hadn't felt since she was a child. Conviction. When she arrived, Wyatt was chopping wood, breath steaming in the icy air. He stopped mid-swing, eyes widening. "You ride in alone at this hour?" he asked. "Something happen?" She dismounted, boots crunching in the snow. "I had to know why," she said. "Why you refused the tools." Wyatt rested his axe against the stump. "Because some things ought to be done 'cause they're right," he said gently. "Not because a man expects a reward." Her breath trembled. In that simple sentence, rugged and raw, she felt the kind of truth her father's gilded walls had never shown her. The space between them warmed, crackling like firewood catching flame. But neither noticed the movement higher up on the ridge, 3 mounted silhouettes, still as stone, watching through the frosted pines. Blackwood's hired men. Sent to follow. Sent to judge. Sent to report. And the line Neol had crossed? It was only becoming more dangerous. Timberline's mercantile hadn't seen this much tension since the whiskey drought of '82. The morning after Neol's secret visit to Wyatt's cabin, folks gathered early, pretending to shop but really hoping to witness another spark between Wyatt Cole and Morgan Blackwood. The air felt tight, stiff, almost metallic, like the moment before a lightning strike. Wyatt had only come to town for flour and nails, But the moment he stepped onto the boardwalk, eyes tracked him from every window. He ignored them, keeping his gait steady, shoulders set in that stubborn, weather-beaten way of his. Thunder snorted behind him, tied to the hitch rail, ears pinned as if he sensed trouble brewing. Inside the mercantile, Blackwood stood by the counter talking to the owner, his posture loose, confident, predatory, the kind of confidence a man displays when he believes the whole town belongs to him. The instant Wyatt stepped through the door, Blackwood's voice carried across the aisles. "Well, if it ain't the man too proud to take a gift," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. Wyatt didn't rise to it. He headed toward the flour sacks. But Blackwood wasn't done. "You think refusing my fiancé's generosity makes you righteous?" The word fiancé was tossed like a stone meant to bruise. Wyatt froze, jaw tightening. Slowly, he set the flour down and turned. "Ain't about righteousness," he said. "Just don't like being bought." Blackwood smiled, thin, brittle, venomous. "Careful, Cole. You're speaking above your station." A murmur rippled through the room. Before Wyatt could answer, the mercantile door swung open, and Judge Silas Croft stepped inside. One arm, one lung that wheezed in cold weather, but a presence so solid and iron-backed that even Blackwood straightened a little. "Morning," the judge said, gaze sweeping the room. Then his eyes landed on Wyatt. "Cole, I hear you stood your ground yesterday." Wyatt shrugged. "Only did what felt right." "I know men who served with less spine," Croft said, loud enough for Blackwood to hear. The town held its breath. Blackwood's smile cracked. "Judge, with all respect, this man insulted a powerful family." "Powerful doesn't mean moral," Croft shot back. "I fought beside men who had nothing but honor, and that made them giants." Wyatt blinked, surprised at the defense he hadn't asked for. Blackwood looked ready to spit nails. Croft stepped closer to Wyatt. "I could use a man like you in my office. The law needs someone who knows right from wrong without needing a ledger to tell him." He lowered his voice just enough. "You interested in honest work that might rattle some cages?" Wyatt hesitated. He'd never imagined himself working for the courthouse, but the judge's steady gaze, worn and sincere, stirred something in him. "I'll hear what you got," Wyatt said. Blackwood barked a humorless laugh. "The clerk's chair? For him? Judge, you're losing your senses." Croft turned sharply. "And you, Blackwood, are losing something else. Your grip on this town." Whispers exploded around the room. For the first time, Blackwood's mask slipped. His eyes turned dark, calculating, stormy with insult. Croft guided Wyatt outside. They walked toward the courthouse, snow crunching under their boots. Inside the warm office, Croft introduced him to Elena Thorne. His daughter, sharp-eyed, quick-witted, a woman who saw through falsehoods the way some folks saw through glass. She sat them down, unfurled a map, and pointed to parcels marked in angry red. "It's a pattern," she said. "Veterans, small ranchers, men who paid what they owed, and still lost everything. Taza's bank and Blackwood's land agents work hand in glove. What happened to your family was never an accident." Wyatt's stomach twisted. Elena slid another ledger forward. "Help us stop them," she said. "We need someone who knows the land, and someone who's not afraid of men like Blackwood." Wyatt exhaled slowly, jaw set, heart heavy with old wounds and new purpose. "All right," he said. "I'm in." Outside, Blackwood watched from across the street, rage simmering like hot tar beneath ice. Wyatt had just made himself an enemy, and the West had long memories. The Timberline Grand Hall glittered like a golden cage that night, lantern light spilling across polished floors and silk banners. The brass band swelled with cheerful notes that didn't match the nerves twisting in Niol's stomach. Women in velvet gowns and men in fine suits circled the room like elegant vultures, smiling, nodding, gossiping with feigned sweetness. Niol stood near the edge of the crowd, her posture straight but tense, the gold locket resting heavily against her collarbone. She felt out of place in a gown chosen by her father's advisors, deep crimson, embroidered, expensive. Beautiful, yes, but not her. Not anymore. At the center of the hall, Taza shook hands with investors, officers, and wealthy ranch owners. His voice boomed warm and confident, his smile sharpened by ambition. He carried himself with pride built on the empire he'd crafted, pride in the contract he would announce tonight. Blackwood, her so-called fiancé, hovered nearby, wearing a smirk that drew whispers from the crowd. His eyes kept drifting toward Niol, prowling over her like acclaim rather than affection. "Ladies and gentlemen," Taza called, lifting his glass, "tonight marks a new era for Timberline." Niol stiffened as he continued. "The Army has renewed our supply contract. Our families, mine and the Blackwoods, will merge our enterprises. Together, we become the strongest force from Montana to the Dakotas." Thunderous applause shook the hall. Niol clapped only when she noticed eyes turning toward her. Her smile felt frozen, brittle, like the thin ice that forms over river water before it can bear weight. This wasn't celebration. It was binding. Later, after the toasts and handshakes, Niol slipped away to the balcony for air. The cold night bit her cheeks, but she welcomed it. Better cold honesty than the warm, suffocating sweetness inside. "Running away from your own party?" The voice came from the shadows. Quiet, sharp, familiar. Niol turned to see Elena Thorne leaning against the railing, cloak wrapped tight around her shoulders. "What are you doing here?" Niol whispered. "Helping someone who deserves the truth," Elena murmured, stepping closer. She slipped a folded piece of paper into Niol's hand. "Don't ask how I got in. Just read it." Niol unfolded the note. "Court records show your father knew the coal farm was current on payments when he approved the foreclosure." E.T., her breath left her body in a cold rush. Her father's crest glinted on her locket like a curse. Elena didn't soften her words. "You asked me to tell you when we found proof. There it is." Niol's knees weakened. The snow-chilled air suddenly felt warmer than the fire-lit hall behind them. I have to see it," she whispered. Elena nodded. "Come to the courthouse at first light." The next morning, Niol stood inside the judge's office, eyes burning as she read through the files Elena had laid out. Ledger entries, letters, foreclosure orders, all signed by Taza, all knowingly fraudulent. Wyatt stood in the corner, arms folded, face unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't pressure. He just let her read. Footsteps thundered in the hall. The door slammed open. Taza stormed in first, Blackwood at his heels, fury snapping through the room like lightning. "Judge Croft!" Taza roared. "You have no authority to interfere in my business." Croft stood his ground. "Your business has harmed dozens of families." Blackwood sneered. "You're overstepping, Judge." Niol froze, hidden behind a bookshelf, as Elena shoved her gently out of sight. She listened, nails digging into her palms, as her father threatened the judge, threatened the court, threatened anyone who dare expose the truth. Wyatt's voice cut through like a blade. "Truth don't scare honest men," he said. Blackwood lunged, but Taza stopped him with a raised hand. "This isn't over," he growled, and the two men stormed out. Silence hung heavy. Neol stepped from hiding, face pale, eyes shining with grief and fury tangled into something raw. Everything she'd believed, cracked open. Everything she'd feared, confirmed. And everything she'd hoped for, suddenly rested in the hands of the very man her family had destroyed. By the time Neol left the courthouse, the sky had already turned the color of pewter. Thick, heavy, ready to break open. Winter storms came fast in Timberline, but this one felt different. It felt intentional, as if the land itself braced for what her world had become. Wyatt walked beside her, his steps quiet, steady, respectful. He didn't speak, didn't reach for her, didn't trespass on the rawness etched across her face. He simply stayed close, like a promise made without words. Snow began to fall. Slow flakes, drifting and soft, masking everything in white. "Elena's right," Neol whispered at last. "I need to see all of it. Every family he ruined, every signature, every lie." Wyatt studied her profile, her trembling jaw, the fierce determination in her dark eyes, the way guilt and grit tangled inside her like two wild horses fighting for the same piece of ground. "You sure?" he asked gently. "Ain't no easing back once you walk that path." She swallowed hard. "I owe the truth more than I owe comfort." Judge Croft's home sat at the edge of town, a sturdy place of books, maps, and memories. That afternoon, as the wind rose, he ushered them inside before the blizzard hit full strength. "You'll be trapped here for the night," Croft warned. "That's all right," Neol said. "I need the time." He nodded and placed a thick stack of ledgers, foreclosure orders, and correspondence on the table. Each document held a piece of her father's empire, an empire she'd grown up believing was noble, honorable, hard-won. Now she saw the ink for what it truly was: weapons, tools, wounds inflicted on men who had less power but more honor. She opened the first folder, then the next, then the next. Hours passed. The storm outside screamed against the walls, rattling the shutters and piling snow against the windows. Lamps flickered. Wyatt sat nearby, sharpening a knife out of habit, his presence a quiet anchor as she faced a storm far worse than the one outside. A name caught her eye, one she recognized even before she saw Wyatt's handwriting on the back. Cole, Jeremiah, and Margaret. Foreclosure order. Seized property. All debts paid. Her breath shuddered. "I didn't know," she whispered, though the words felt too small, too fragile. "I didn't know what he did. To you? To them?" Wyatt set down the knife. "I reckon you didn't," he said softly. "I never held you to your father's sins." But she did. For the first time, she held herself accountable for the world she'd benefited from. Another page, another family, and another. 23 in total, lives uprooted, dreams bankrupted, futures carved open by a fountain pen held in her father's steady hand. Tears finally broke free, silent but sharp, slipping down her cheeks like thawed ice. Wyatt rose slowly, approached her as if approaching a skittish horse, and laid a calloused hand gently on her shoulder. "You're stronger than what he built," he murmured. "Stronger than what he broke." She met his eyes, stormy, vulnerable, determined. "I have to confront him," she said. "I need to hear him admit it, one last time, before we stop all this." Croft stepped closer, cane tapping on the floor. "Then we make a plan. But you won't go alone. Wyatt will take you as far as the estate. He'll wait outside. No one intimidates you into silence again." Lightning flashed beyond the frosted window, illuminating the blizzard's swirling fury. The storm outside raged. The storm inside her steadied. She wasn't running from the truth anymore. She was marching straight toward it. And when the snow settled, nothing in Timberline would be the same. Snow softened the world by morning, laying a quiet white blanket over Timberline that made even the sharpest edges seem gentler. But Neil felt none of that gentleness as she stood at the foot of her father's estate, breath clouding in the cold, fingers wrapped tight around the ledger Judge Croft had given her. Wyatt rode beside her, thunder stamping at the snow. He didn't speak, didn't offer advice. He simply nodded, steady, supportive, rugged as the mountains behind him. "I'll be right here," he said quietly. Neil swallowed, heart pounding. "I know." She stepped inside alone. Her father's study was warm. Too warm. The fire roaring high as though he'd been pacing in front of it all night. Taza looked older than she'd ever seen him. His hair was damp from snow, his cravat undone, the weight of sleepless hours pulled deep under his eyes. "You came," he said, voice hoarse. "Because I needed answers," she answered. He gestured her forward, but she didn't move. Instead, she set the ledger on his desk, open, undeniable. "Father," she whispered, "tell me this isn't what it looks like." Taza closed his eyes, and in that moment, she knew. "When your mother died," he said slowly, "I built an empire so you'd never feel powerless, so no man could hurt you, so the world would bow instead of take." His hands trembled. "But somewhere in all that, I forgot where the line was." "You stole from men who trusted you," she said, voice breaking. "Men who paid what they owed. You ruined families." I told myself it was survival. He looked up at her, weathered, fragile in a way power rarely allowed. But it was greed and fear. She pressed a hand to her chest, to the locket that now felt like a weight instead of a blessing. "You hurt Wyatt," she whispered. "You hurt me." He nodded slowly. "I did." Silence stretched, long and heavy. Then Taza reached into a drawer and placed a leather-bound ledger beside hers, inked with Blackwood's handwriting, detailing bribes, forged signatures, illegal seizures. "Take it," he said. "Use it. Expose him. I'll testify." Neil blinked. "You're giving up everything." "Then I fall," he murmured, echoing the words he'd once used to justify his empire. "But better I fall with truth than stand on lies." For the first time since childhood, she embraced him. Not as the man he wanted to be, but as the flawed, tired man he truly was. Blackwood was arrested by sundown. By spring, Taza had sold off his holdings to repay every family he'd wronged. He moved to a modest cabin outside town, rebuilding not wealth but character, with his own 2 hands and none of the gold that had once blinded him. Wyatt Cole got his family farm back. One morning, while he was repairing the porch rail, he heard soft footsteps. Neil stood at the gate, hair loose in the spring wind, a schoolteacher's books tucked under one arm. "You fixed it up," she said softly. "Trying to," he replied. "Still needs a woman's touch." She smiled, small and warm. "Good thing I came along then." They sat on the porch, drinking coffee that was still terrible, laughing about it anyway. Sunlight warmed their joined hands, and the thaw, slow, honest, and precious, began. "Wyatt," she said gently, "if I asked you to take a trip with me, not as a rich woman and a poor man, not as 2 people from different worlds, but just 2 wanderers trying again, would you go?" He squeezed her fingers. "Yeah," he said. "I reckon I would." The wind carried the scent of new earth, the promise of green shoots, the hush of a west slowly healing. And their hands stayed intertwined. Now here's my question for you, listener. If you were in Neol's boots, torn between the world you were born into and the life you truly wanted. What choice would you make? If you enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next story from the wild American West.